Have you ever read a PCAOB release and thought, this was definitely written by an advisor to a committee of an agency supervised by another committee? Because tonight we've got something rare. A guy who looked at audit equality situations and said, you know what this needs? An anonymous letter. Not a LinkedIn post, not a conference panel, not a polite comment with 3 bullet points and a thank you for your consideration. An anonymous letter to the PCAOB, basically the audit equivalent of a note slid into your high school saying, hey, I saw what you did. We need to be better. And you know it too. And the wild part, a lot of what we're living through right now, QC 1000, quality management, operational accountability, was being argued about for years before it even got a name. So if you're public accounting and you've heard mumbles of QC 1000, and maybe you think it's just more documentation, this episode's for you. Because the firms that win aren't the ones with the prettiest templates. They're the ones who can turn quality control into real behavior, supervision, review timing, staffing, consultation, and proving it when the PCAOB comes knocking, assuming it's still around. Oh yeah, we're going there again. I'm always going to toe that line. And with this rhyme, let's take a ride because it's time to get qualified. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Qualified Opinions, the show where we give the audit community the content that they deserve, talking quality, technology, and transformation that CPA professionals need to know without pulling you into a compliance coma. I'm Drew Carrick, the Rapping CPA, your host, and alongside me is Chris Vanover, founder of CPAClub and former PCAOB director, here for color commentary and to keep us honest when we get into the regulatory weeds. So far, so good, Chris?
Absolutely. Let's go.
Great. We'd love to hear it. Now, today's guest is Bob Conway, retired audit partner, deeply experienced in audit regulation, and someone who has been thinking about quality management for a long time, like before it was trendy and before the PCAOB had a name. Bob is also known for something legendary in his space. While he was part of ACAP, the Advisory Committee on the Auditing Profession, he wrote an anonymous letter earlier to the PCAOB basically saying, we have to get more serious about audit quality. So today we're going to unpack everything PCAOB, SEC, ACAP, and every other acronym that we accountants can come up with, how Bob got involved and what drove him to write that letter, and then continue on in that realm. And then we'll go practical, QC implementation, monitoring, how to scale it to firm size, and how engagement performance metrics can actually help you monitor quality while work is in progress. So Bob, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I'm excited. Thanks for the great intro.
Yeah, I take a lot of pride in the intros, as I know you take a lot of pride in quality management and all things PCAOB. So I know we're going to get into some of the nuances of perhaps this letter later, but similar to how I went niche viral in the accounting world for a music video that only auditors understand, you are a bit infamous in our little niche world as well. So let's paint the scene for us on how you got there to that point. Maybe a little career arc, and then I want to go into 2003 because you said that's when monitoring first hit you.
Yeah, so I was a long time at KPMG, 26 years, 17 as an audit partner. From there, I went on, did a stint with the PCAOB, led the Orange County, Los Angeles offices for about 9 years. And eventually, well, I'll tie all this together, but I ultimately wrote a book called The Truth About Public Accounting. And it was a little bit of the silver lining to the COVID pandemic, because I had been writing a book for a long time. And this was obviously the best time because we couldn't do much else. And published that book. And it is all about trying to drive some ideas about audit quality that, as Drew said, came to me going back to, circa 2003. And the best way to tell the story is how it actually rolled out. I was in my office, I was working through my to-dos, and a box came in, and I thought, well, this looks more fun than my to-do list. So everybody likes opening boxes. You don't know what's inside. And what I found it was the firm's brochures that we were obligated to give audit committees pursuant to the stock exchange listing standards that talk about our firm's commitment to audit quality. And I'm going through the brochure, and it's got all these, glossy pictures. Auditing looks really cool, skyscrapers, all of that. And it tells the story about how we hire the best people, we train them, we mentor them, we supervise them, we have performance reviews, we have all these national resources at their fingertips, alternative career paths within the firm. And I thought, wow, this really sounds like a wonderful place to work. It really painted an idyllic picture. And then it hit me. I thought, wait a minute, they're describing where I work, and what I'm experiencing isn't lining up with the story in the glossy brochure. My experience was we had heavy workloads that drove turnover, that drove experience levels down. It drove down year-over-year continuity on audits. The partners and managers also had heavy workloads, and that got in the way of their supervision and review of what was essentially a relatively inexperienced staff. And from my perspective, the label I would put over this, there was a lot of chaos because every time turnover occurred or new work came in and the schedule got reworked, the quality of the staffing on each engagement seemed to suffer. And then if the senior left on your own engagement or the manager left on your own engagement, I found myself stepping in to try to hold things together and meet deadlines. And so at that time, it struck me how there were two different views of the same reality. And for a while, I just kind of thought about why is it the way things are? And I tend to think about that for a lot of things in life. I'm a real believer in competition and free markets, and I couldn't understand why, if those elements were really operating effectively, why were things the way they were inside public accounting? And it's no secret, the workloads, the turnover, all of that. Those are common complaints from controllers and CFOs about auditors. And I thought a bit more and I started to piece together a little bit of a puzzle because I also looked at my experience on proposals, and everything seemed very fee dominated. It was almost unheard of to come in with a fee estimate that was much higher than a competitor and get the work. And that's when it hit me that really what we had was a commodity pricing environment. And as I studied that concept a little bit more, and something called audits are called credence goods. They sort of reside inside a black box. People pay for them, but they really don't know too much about what they're getting. And I realized with the commodity pricing, the way you achieve the level of profits that the partners think they deserve, and I think they deserve profits too, but I think there's a better way to get there. The levers that you manipulate are you push people for productivity, and that's what causes the workloads, the turnover, all that. You're also pretty tight on salaries, and the last several years with the whole pipeline issue in the industry, there's been a lot of talk about salaries not being up to par with alternatives. And then the other thing that's come into play big time is you start offshoring work to other jurisdictions. You cut down on the real estate footprint, expense control, and every time there's been a productivity improvement, for instance, the laptop innovation helped efficiency enormously. And there was a brief period where I thought, wow, we're getting out of the price, beating each other up over price. And it wasn't long before equilibrium had adjusted and we were back to the same lifestyle. So I began to formulate this idea. What would things be like if the people that bought audit services had more information that might relate to audit quality? And it wasn't that I was going to define audit quality, but auditing is a labor-intensive business. It's a lot of people, and granted, there's use of technology and all of that, but at the foundation, it really is people-intensive. So things like workloads and supervision and review, staff continuity are really important. And so I started to talk to peers within KPMG about these concepts, and everybody at the lower levels agreed with me, but if I went a little higher level, I met a lot of resistance. And at about the same time, the PCAOB had been founded, and then a kind of a miraculous thing. A fellow came into my office and he says, "Bob, I'm thinking about joining the PCAOB." And I said, "Well, you've got to relocate to Washington, D.C." And he said, "No, I don't. They've got office space on the 11th floor of our building." And I thought, holy cow. And so all of a sudden I started thinking, if there was a place to take my concept, it was the PCAOB. And, long story short, I joined the PCAOB on April 4th, 2005. I attended the national training. It happened to coincide with my first day of work. The chairman was there. He gave a keynote address, and part of the way through his speech, he said, one of the things that really bugs me is I get a lot of complaints from CFOs and controllers about young auditors ask the same questions over and over. They never come back year after year. There's all these inherent inefficiencies. And I thought, wow, this is right down the alley. This is exactly why I came to the PCAOB, was to further my thinking about what if we put information out there. And I'll pause for a moment. And an important thing to note is, when I titled my book, The Truth About Public Accounting, the subtitle is Understanding and Managing the Risks That the Auditors Bring to the Audit. And everybody's accustomed to the risk assessment around the financial reporting entity, but I was looking at the risk assessment around the auditors, because to me that's where a big part of the risk was, that you had and audits don't come off the assembly line like widgets. There's a lot of variability, and a lot of it goes back into the nuances of scheduling issues, people getting pulled left and right, the heavy workloads. And I just thought it was important to draw more attention to this. And I had this vision about how we could put some information out there about the human element, the workloads, the turnover, the experience levels, the continuity, the ratio between staff and partners and managers. And that might inform audit committees to make more informed decisions. And my basic premise was this. If you're the leader of a large firm, do you want to be in last place when this information is shared? And the notion at the time was, in fact, an academic had said, one of the beauties of all of this is that the Wall Street Journal and others will pick up on this information, and they'll do side-by-side comparisons. And again, no leader wants to be in last place. No audit committee wants to hire the firm that's in last place. And to me, the most powerful and has really been untapped is the notion that no employee wants to go to work for the firm that has the heaviest workloads, the least continuity, the poorest supervision and review, the least amount of training. So to me, it really fit. And so now I go back to that my first day at the PCAOB, the chairman's remarks. I get back after the training, I get back to my home office, and I talked to the local office leader. I said, and he knew where I stood, my thoughts on this subject. I bring it up to just about everybody I've run into. And at this point, I can assure you, I've talked to at least 1,000 people person to person on this subject. And I've yet to meet people that say, gee, Bob, I don't think that's going to work. It's always been met enthusiastically.
And this is in 2008 that we're referring to?
So this is 2005, just my first day at the PCAOB. And so I said, I'd really like to write a letter to the chairman that describes my thinking. And help me understand who should I CC and what are the protocols. And he said, Bob, normally you'd kind of work through the chain of command, but you're responding directly to something that he said during his speech. So he said, go ahead, compose the email, just copy the division leader and the division leader lieutenant. And so I did. And And within a couple of days, I started getting all these messages from the chairman of the firm saying, Bob, this is a great idea. I've talked to the Doug Carmichael in charge of standards. He thinks we can work this into a quality control standard. And it just kept on coming. And he said, wow, I can't believe you've been here just a couple of weeks and look at what you've contributed. But then came the call from the division leader. And he said, Bob, I don't like this idea. If you've got ideas, you bring them to me first and I'll decide what to do about them. But he also made it clear that he didn't like the idea. So he basically was telling me he was going to kibosh the whole thing. And
just curious,
and so I thought, well, that was a blow.
You mentioned that everyone you've presented this concept to has obviously been received it very favorably, but that particular individual seemed to push back. What was the reason behind that?
Yeah, his thinking was he was concerned that the PCAOB might take this as some kind of silver bullet that would detract from the regular inspection regime. And I never intended that, and I don't think the board ever would have thought that way. There were some curious arguments, in the early foundation of the PCAOB about what's the right mix between hiring attorneys and auditors, and naturally the inspection division thought hiring auditors was the best thing. But I didn't see this recommendation as a threat to hiring auditors. But it was pretty clear that I was not on his favorite list. And quite frankly, I was stunned. I really thought about, well, what should I do? I just spent like 9 months, trying to extricate myself from KPMG in an orderly fashion, take care of my clients. But I thought, I'm just going to hang in there. I'm going to put my nose to the grindstone. I'm going to work hard, build my reputation. And that's what I did. But then came, in 2007, the Treasury Department announced the formation of this advisory committee on the auditing profession. And the idea was it was a blue ribbon panel, chaired by Arthur Levitt, former chairman at the SEC, co-chaired by Don Nicolaisen, former chief accountant at the SEC, and a whole host of icons in the accounting profession. And the idea that the headline really was about the sustainability of the audit profession. And I thought, wow, this is, and one of their primary tasks was to look at, human resources and competition. And I thought, wow, this is great. By then we had a new chairman, and he was familiar. I had approached him with my ideas before, but very confidentially. And I said, I'd really like to submit a paper to this advisory committee on the auditing profession. He says, Bob, go ahead. That's great. Just follow the ethics protocol. Be sure you say you're not speaking for the board and all of that. And so I did that. But then I came to the final moment when I'm about to submit this thing, and I'm talking to the ethics officer and explained to her my conundrum, because I said, I got beat up pretty bad for communicating to the chairman. I'd hate to think what might happen if I communicate to this blue ribbon panel. And I said, I'm thinking about submitting this recommendation anonymously. And she said, well, I can neither encourage nor discourage you. That's really your personal decision. And I chose to submit it anonymously, probably the biggest mistake I made in my career, because as it turned out, ultimately this recommendation got a lot of attention, really well received by ACAP. And then ACAP published its final report, and there was a recommendation in there that ironically said, PCAOB, you need to consider the feasibility and benefits of providing, information about the audit, input measures and output measures. Mine was more focused, admittedly, on input measures, but I thought, okay, output measures make sense too. And we were off to the races. But I still continued about a year and a half before I ever revealed who was. I signed that recommendation. I was the anonymous retired audit partner. And it was kind of a parlor game. Who is this person? And, there was all kinds of speculation, but I stayed in the shadows. And then finally, I thought, okay, this thing has so much momentum, and I want to be part of the solution. And so I introduced myself to Lynn Turner, who was one of the biggest supporters, former chief accountant, at a conference. And I said, Lynn, I'm the anonymous retired audit partner. And one of the highlights of my life, he said, Bob, that recommendation was phenomenal. And he repeated it like 3 times. And so then began, and I'm sorry I'm talking too much here, but
and Bob, maybe before we get to that next point, I'm curious, like ACAP 2007, 2008, I think back to that time, I was at PwC as an audit manager. Financial crisis obviously occurred in 2008. What was it that caused ACAP to even spin up back in 2007? I'm thinking, okay, Enron and Andersen, that was 2001 timeframe. What was transpiring between 2001 and then to where, hey, we need to actually get a committee together to actually study the audit profession?
Well, I'm not sure if it's in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, but there had always been this notion that after the act is, becomes reality and it all starts to roll out, let's take a look at where we are. And it is, the credit crisis, it is interesting. You're right. The timing is concurrent. A little bit slightly after that was the Madoff crisis. But I think there was genuinely just a notion that we were concerned about the failure of Arthur Andersen. We were concerned, a lot of people were concerned about the quadropoly, in other words, the monopoly of 4 firms serving such a high concentration of the market, that it made sense at that time to do this revisit. And
but there wasn't
I want to just add in one, there's so many quotes from this proceeding, but the one that I go to a lot, and it's in my book, I talk about it almost every time when I write a paper. Don Nicolaisen, co-chair of the committee, he said that the firms have always competed on price, and the results have been disastrous both for the firms and investors. And to me, that really says it all. To me, that's a lead example of why we need to look for ways to elevate quality and to elevate competition and get away from the commodity pricing environment.
So that's a good point that you bring up there. And that's just something that's kind of circulated through my mind throughout my career in the auditing profession and just the accounting profession in general. And I wonder, from your perspective, have you ever dove deep into like the source behind that? Because I think when it comes to like an agency, right, like the FDA or somebody, if it's reviewing health products or food products, it becomes a very easy sell, right? To say, oh yeah, of course we need this, and they need to be a quality organization that's going to do a good job and making sure that we have the highest of standards that we've passed. We do metal testing on bridges, and we want to make sure that it's completely safe. And I think there's often this stigma, and like you talk about, it's commoditized. It becomes a race to the bottom. It's just who can do it the cheapest, because it's not valued as much by a lot of these companies. Was that ever part of like the discussion? How do you showcase the importance and the value there, especially for somebody who maybe is like, audit's kind of just like, you just got to get it done. And I think that is very often a sentiment. So how do you get at that sort of root cause of showing like the value that comes with why quality is important?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it kind of gets to the heart of the commoditization. Every audit report looks substantially the same. And so the only thing that's different is the name of the firm signing the report. And there had just been, even after Sarbanes-Oxley, a continuation of audit failures and a lot of frustration as to, well, how did this happen? And some of it at its core comes down, the audit firms, one of the biggest passes they get is that the audit opinion provides reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance. And so they use that to distance themselves in a legal situation. It's not easy to bring the firms to account. But on the other hand, there have been some very large settlements. And so, you know, the interesting thing was when the PCAOB, right out of the gate after the ACAP report was issued, they had a standing advisory group to talk about, okay, what should the PCAOB do? And there was a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement. And I thought, wow, this is great. We're off to the races. But as time evolved, this moniker, audit quality indicators, got attached. And I remember vividly one day talking to Mark Olson, the chairman, who okayed me sending the letter to ACAP. He said, Bob, you had a great idea. It stimulated a lot of great discussion. But the conclusion is we can't definitively measure audit quality. And I said, Mark, I never said we should embark on measuring audit quality. I said there's a lot of important stuff that goes in that the firms generally are monitoring. They already have this information. And if you delve down into it, it shows a degree of chaos. And wouldn't we be better off? The question really should have been, are audit committees better off with this information than without? And it took a long time to steer the discussion back in that direction. In 2015, the PCAOB published the concept release on audit quality indicators. Chris played a major role in that. It was a very thoughtful document. The Center for Audit Quality initially came out very supportive, but again, they started to spiral down into this notion that audit quality defies measurement, and so I spoke up again, and Lynn Turner kept speaking up, and a number of other icons in the industry kept bringing this up, that this was one of the things the PCAOB had not acted on. And so fast forward to, we're getting close to, I guess maybe around 2019, I can't remember precisely, but the firm put out an exposure draft on quality control. And the irony is that should have been the first standard the PCAOB did back in 2005. But instead it came very late. The existing quality control standard was very archaic. Not a lot of beef to it, not a lot of structure. And so in my mind, when I looked at the first proposal or thought piece on it, I thought this is really good, except it's leaving it up to the firms to decide, what to monitor. And I totally get it that it's up to them to be responsible for their own quality. But as a regulator, I think sometimes you have to put down the hammer and say, okay, it would really help a lot if we could have some comparability among these things, these metrics, and so wouldn't it help if they all had to work with the same metrics?
Now, is this related to the shift? Because I know you talk about it, right? Like the shift in the priorities of the PCAOB over time and over, and it's very relevant now, of course, with like how is the board going to be moving forward? It sounds like from early on, it was very just inspection after the fact base. And the whole premise of this is like, we need to get out in front of these things, right? And have there be certain signals in order to measure. And the measurement can't be like, yeah, we'll go back afterwards and we'll take a look at how well you did. It's no, we have to find a way to measure in real time that things are happening.
Yeah, maybe Drew, to follow on that real quick, I kind of think about it, I know, Bob, you've mentioned this before in some of your comparisons, is look at the airline industry, right? An extremely regulated industry where we all see what the actual impact is if an airline gets it wrong, right? And so there's a ton of resources and energy put into making sure that a aircraft is fit for flight. But on top of that, there are specific rules that are out there that say a pilot has to be fit for flight as well, right? And so it's no different than a partner. But I wonder if somehow it's because we see a news, I go back to the Miracle on the Hudson with Sully Sullenberger, and ultimately, we all know where we were in that moment, and we're like, oh my gosh, that's incredible what he was able to do and land that on the Hudson. But then you look at it and go, okay, if Sully had shown up and he hadn't had sleep, and whatever it was in X number of days, a lot of people would have been hesitant to get on that flight. But that was part of his fit for duty, right? And you think about, is it because that moment lives in our brain, it's seared in our brain because it's so much more impactful because we see the potential for casualties? Do we just not see that on the audit side at the end of the day? And because, hey, people's financials are impacted by this stuff, but maybe because we don't necessarily see the actual, how dramatic the impact is, could that be why people aren't maybe chasing this down?
It's unfortunate. I mean, if you think about the airlines and healthcare, that affects people's lives. Auditing does not affect their health. It might very well affect their finances because they might lose money if they invested in a company that failed and the auditors didn't do their job. And so, but when you look at the sums of money that Enron, I think the market cap lost, blown away, was something about approaching $70 billion. And then you look at the massive sums from Madoff and all of these failures. And then you get into the credit crisis and one that I talk about in my book is the Colonial Bank and the failure to properly audit the collateral for a bunch of loans that were made to this Taylor Bean Whitaker that was originating mortgages. And the interesting anecdote, it turned out the senior who was auditing the collateral for these loans said, "This is above my pay grade." And so they switched him out of that role. And the amazing thing is PwC brought in a college-age intern. And the judge, when she rendered her final order, and this particular claim by the FDIC cost PwC $335 million, she excoriated the firm for not better managing the resources brought to the job. And so to me, these are huge things, and yet we seem to go about our daily life. It's a little bit like the giant fines against the Wall Street firms. And I hate to say it, but it seems to become a cost of doing business. But the other thing that I look at is, what about protecting the careers of the people that are in the profession? And nobody joins public accounting thinking, oh, I want to be part of a big audit failure. You got a lot of hardworking people that are trying their best. And so it's important for the audit firms to give these people the time, the resources, and tools they need to succeed. And so that then, back now to the QC 1000, and I think fundamentally the concepts are good. I do think it's disappointing that the metrics aren't mandated, at least for the firms, issuing over 100, public company audit reports. I realize there's such a big spectrum. You've got a lot of smaller firms that are still doing public company audits, and there's a much needed, need for them to perform those services. And so I'm going to leap ahead a little bit and just talk about where I think the firms are in this regard. And so much of this, to be honest with you, is almost about the PCAOB trying to catch up its standards to where the firms are. Because the bigger firms, they could see this coming. And now I'm going to go back in time just a little bit, a flashback. But one of the neat things was about 2014, PwC was the first firm to publish its transparency report that not only provided an array of audit quality indicators that matched up with the things I was looking for, but they did it it was 3 years of comparative data, the current year, the prior year, and the year before that. So they did a huge job. And then at the same time, Deloitte, when they came out with their similar report, they had a placeholder and it said, we're just waiting for the PCAOB to tell us what to measure and what to report. And I thought, wow, this thing is so teed up. It'd be easy for the PCAOB to step in, but it must have been an interesting philosophical argument. You know, do we mandate or do we leave it up to the firms? I certainly thought the metrics should have been mandated. And in time, you see the PCAOB finally dumped the audit quality indicator moniker, AQI, and instead came up with firm and engagement performance metrics. And that is a much better title for what we're talking about. These are metrics, mainly human resource related that pertain to the audit, and they're at the engagement level. And so the PCAOB took a bold step, but now let me go back to QC 1000 because that preceded the
So before we get into the QC 1000, Bob, one of the things that I think at like the, I guess at a meta level that this sort of highlights, you have a company like PwC as a firm, they're getting ahead of this, the decision to be transparent, to kind of be essentially ahead of what the regulators are saying. Do you believe it to be altruistic, or is it truly just a self-serving thing? Because at the end of the day, right, like what I'm curious about when it comes to like a QC 1000 implementation, and this is kind of standard, it kind of hinging on how hard the PCAOB is going to push to to have these mandates, very governmental, very governmental government involved. Is there any? I think when it comes to like airplanes, regardless of whether there was regulations or not, people would want to ensure that if they were getting on a plane, there was somebody checking it because they genuinely, care. They don't need to be told to care. I don't need to be told to wear a seatbelt. I want to wear a seatbelt because I want to be safe, right?
Right.
Without it being a law. That's one where you could say, okay, do we have to mandate this or not? Do you think this is a situation where no matter what, these are things that have to be mandated? It's got to be a judicial sort of top-down government approach, or is there any angle whatsoever where this stems from the community itself?
I think, PwC and the others, they saw this movement coming. It had tremendous inertia, and they were working to get out ahead of it. And I'll talk in a minute about some of the proactive things they were doing. I think one of the rubs, and I think a lot of this has been misconstrued, but there was considerable debate about making this public at the individual engagement level. And to me, that was very important because when it comes down to competition, if you don't have information at the individual engagement level, if I'm on the audit committee of a company in Phoenix and I'm looking at competing proposals for the other firms in Phoenix, well, I need to know how they compare. And if the only way I'm going to know is if they publish the metrics on all of their public company work in the area and come up with composite metrics for their office. I mean, here's part of the problem. When you look at the proposals, they are filled with a lot of promises, and there's never a true up to what was actually delivered. I mean, maybe some cases, budget overruns and stuff like that, but shouldn't the audit committee member know whether the audit they just bought and was delivered was the product of perfect execution, or was it chaos? And again, back to the notion that audits aren't widgets, there's a lot of variability, and it's not a tight distribution around a bell-shaped curve. It's more. There's a lot of audits on the tail going both ways.
Bob, I'm curious because I think Drew brings up an interesting point here. At the end of the day, people put on a seatbelt because they're concerned that if they don't, they ultimately may lose their life, right? So how do you get people, in your view, to actually care about an audit? Because I think most people perceive that it's not value add, it's a compliance exercise, and they just have to do it because it's mandated. How do you get them? Because I think in order for people to actually want to see these transparency reports, to actually want to be able to evaluate an auditor, fundamentally, I think there has to be, okay, I'm on board with this because I want to make sure I'm getting the value that I need out of this audit. How do you get people to shift to that mindset?
Maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I always thought if I was an audit committee chair, one of the most important decisions is the auditor retention decision. And again, back to the subtitle of my book, understanding and managing the risks the auditors bring to the audit. I want to be sure that my audit firm is managing those risks and controlling my risks. And to me, more important than critical audit matters is what did the staffing on the engagement look like? Sure. I know it looked great 6 months before the audit started, but so much changes as you move through the busy season, and then some audits become very chaotic. And to me, it comes down to, if I was an audit committee member, if I had access to these metrics, I would have some indication whether there was a risk that audit quality had been compromised. And I'd like to know, what did the audit firm do to assure that my audit was not compromised? And in some cases...
and Bob, I'm curious, are you seeing evidence where, again, you're talking about the duty of an audit committee member is to select an audit firm that actually fulfills its objectives, right?
Right.
Are you seeing situations where the audit committee members are actually held accountable in the event that the audit goes awry? In other words, they made a bad business decision, and who's paying the price for that at the end of the day?
That's a great question, and it really gets to a key issue, and this is part of the problem, is there have been very few instances where audit committees have been taken to task for how they execute their responsibilities. There was one case back in 2015 called Magnum Hunter, where I think one audit committee member got disciplined by the SEC, but that happens very little. And there's a few things going on. There's the D&O insurance that helps insulate these people. And here's, I've got an article coming out about this just in the next few days, but there are concerns that an audit committee member, they do work hard. There's a lot of work involved, but to some people, it's seen as a plum assignment, and they don't want to jeopardize it by rocking the boat. And so they start sounding a little more like management. Well, the one thing we can control are the fees, and they get lost in fees. They lose the focus on quality for the sake of fees. And so, again, if you had more transparency, and here's what this is another kind of putting it all together. The Center for Audit Quality has been vocal about the lack of transparency around audit committee activities. And, there's an audit committee report in the proxy, and they tend to be very boilerplate. They tend to talk very little about their thinking on, retaining the auditor. And if they had more of these metrics out there, then they would be exposed. Somebody would say, wait a minute, I've looked at the metrics and I'm trying to understand, how did you select the firm that has the poorest record on delivering, at least on the human resource element? High turnover, low continuity, high leverage, all of that. And so what happens is there's a few things. The audit committees don't want to rock the boat, and they live in the shade a bit. What they do does not get a lot of transparency. So I think you could really elevate the work of the audit committees.
For the audience, let's be clear, because I want to make this point, is that audit committees are responsible for ultimately making the decision about who is the independent auditor, correct?
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to bring up another example here, and Drew, you can add into this if you think it's necessary. But when you look at the recent couple years ago, a very famous case came out called BF Borgers, right, out of Colorado. And ultimately, the SEC shut him down and actually called him a sham audit mill because he was just basically pumping out audit reports for public companies that actually didn't necessarily have any audit work associated with it. So at one point, it was almost like 200 Form AP filings indicating he was the signing partner on these reports within a given year, which is just, I don't know how anybody even thinks about doing that, but he did it. And I guess the question becomes, who bears the accountability in that situation? Because in theory, all those public companies have an audit committee, I presume, that made a hiring decision to engage with BF Borgers. Well, are they being held accountable at this point, or is it's just over?
And it also sounds like they don't do their due diligence either, right? Like, because if you just nobody buys a product online anymore that hasn't researched to be like, is this guru legit? Is he actually going to teach me how to do drop shipping so that I can make $100,000 a month, or is this guy blowing smoke up my bottom because they're just trying to make a quick buck off of people's desire to have money? And I wonder if it's very similar when it comes to how in depth is the audit committee actually going in evaluating this, or is it just like, oh well, they got the lowest price, stuff checks out on paper, we're not going to look any further into this? Well, and to Chris's point, who's accountable?
Yeah. They don't know, first off, to Bob's point, what they're buying at the end of the day.
Right.
I think that goes back to, you have to figure out a way to help firms differentiate their services, and through that may come through audit quality indicators or firm and engagement performance metrics, right? But again, I want to go back to Bob. I mean, Bob, do you think that audit committee members should be held accountable when there actually is, quote unquote, an audit failure?
Oh, they should. I mean, it's tricky though, and this is where the absence of information, if the information was out there, again, what audit committee would want to select BF Borgers would have busted all the metrics and would have been an obvious problem. There's a somewhat analogous, it maybe didn't reach the sham audit mill level, but Markham, had partners with outrageous workloads. SEC had brought a case. They ultimately dropped it because of the Jarchese decision. But the audit committees, unfortunately, don't know what they don't know. And to me, that's why.
It almost feels, I mean, again, I'm thinking here outside, just basically thinking out loud, but it almost seems as if there has to be some sort of, and Drew, you hit on this, right? A due diligence checklist that audit committees need to go through in order to justify why they actually hire an auditor. And some of that may be, okay, evaluate the transparency report. Have you gone to the PCAOB website and reviewed the Form 2 that the firm recently filed? Have there been any sanctions against this firm? And I think, Bob, you and I and others in the profession that follow this closely, we know there's data out there. Now, I guess the question becomes, how transparent are firms in providing that data, or how sophisticated are the audit committee members to actually go and find that data and do their homework? Yeah. Or does there need to be, and maybe this is what firm and engagement metrics hopefully would have done, is actually some sort of data set that actually is manageable and reviewable so that an audit committee can actually justify why they in fact hired the auditor they did.
You know what it sounds like we need to do is get an unboxing series going, and then we're gonna every episode of the show is unboxing a different firm, and you're gonna go through, because that's a lot of the times. Again, it is that, where's that information? Where do you do to find my, rate my professor, find a therapist, and everybody looks at the reviews and says, oh, this one is a shady area, or this person is very mean, this person's super caring, they're the best, and then that's how you kind of seek out who you want to go to. It's a consumer report for auditors.
You've got information,
exactly.
and you're letting the market decide at the end of the day who they actually hire and fire. And I think that's what's missing here from the public accounting at the end of the day. And again, I think a lot of what Bob has talked about today is setting the stage for, there's data out there. It's just that people aren't necessarily using that data to help them make informed decisions, which is really ironic because accounting is a language of business that's supposed to actually help people make decisions.
Right. So back to the original part of your question. I'm flashing back. There was a discussion in going back to ACAP where one individual specifically commented that the audit committee, they hold the contract. They've got the power to award that contract to competing firms. And there's nothing that says audit committees can't ask for that information. And because they have the contract, in odds are, if it's a sizable dollars, the firms will want to comply. Now, the next question is, will they just give sham statistics about their operations? But to complete the picture a little bit, there was an audit firm in Las Vegas that was hiring high school kids to crank out audit reports. I mean, this has happened again and again, and I'm not saying that the sham audit report is the exception, but there's kind of a continuum of, okay, how much audit work are we doing? There's this trade-off between profitability and quality. There's a trade-off between client retention and quality. There's all these threats that tell me the regulators need to be more prescriptive, and instead we've gone down this open-ended path.
And Bob, I know we've been talking more about audit committee, hire, fire the auditors, and maybe we have to introduce some metrics that help them evaluate that decision-making process, and let the market then decide who they hire and fire. But I think the inverse of that is interesting to look at too. And you brought up high school students. Maybe we can unpack that now. When you think about, and I've taught college classes in auditing accounting over the years, and I often share with the students, here are the firm transparency reports. Go look at a disciplinary order for Markham, where you'll actually see that a Markham engagement quality reviewer was working more than 100-hour work weeks, week after week in a particular cycle, right? And because, again, I want the students to make better informed decisions, because I go back to what you first talked about. You looked at these glossy brochures that convey just this perfect utopia within a CPA firm that we all know doesn't actually truly exist. And I think a lot of students are looking at a website and going, wow, this firm looks great. And they're not necessarily making informed decisions about the firm that they actually choose to spend the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, maybe even 30 years of their life. And they're making very short-sighted, misguided decisions, right? And so the flip side is this information could also be equally powerful. And you brought it up, right? You don't want to be the firm that finishes in last place. Well, let the students decide ultimately which firms are the best of the best, because the students will naturally go to the firms that are actually outperforming other firms. And that's going to have a ripple effect in terms of who they can actually get to support these engagements going forward. So I think you can kind of solve for it on both sides just through these metrics that are available and out there.
To me, I've always thought the most powerful lever would be the prospective employees, the students, because the firms, they have to hire the people. They can't go a busy season and not hire 25 people or whatever the number is. And so, and then, you've got the whole pipeline crisis, and that would change things the fastest. I not to undermine the power of competition in the eyes of the audit committee or the leaders of the firms, but hiring people is an annual event, if not a year-round event. And so if the prospective students knew more about what they were getting into and could make a more informed decision, they're obviously going to go with the firm that has workloads that are reasonable compared to competing firms. Firms that offer more training compared to competing firms that have better supervision and review, as evidenced by the ratio of partners and managers to staff, and so that would move things like an earthquake. And it killed me when I started reading about the pipeline crisis, and a lot of people published a lot of things, and the firms, the CPA societies, and they would all talk about this issue, but it's kind of remarkable. They stayed clear of the whole issue about work-life balance, which is essentially part of what we're talking about. And especially with the current generation, that's super important. And it really does matter to the people just trying to decide between which big firm they associate with. So I appreciate you emphasizing that part, Chris, because and for whatever reason, the PCAOB has stayed clear of that avenue. And I think they maybe feel like it's not part of their jurisdiction. I would argue it is part of their jurisdiction.
Yeah, the individual, I think, is often overlooked. Like we do this at the macro level, but as an individual, right, you're going to be more incentivized to perform better, to be a better quality auditor and the best you can be when you feel like you really cherish this role that you have. You cherish this job and position that you're in. And, I thinking back to the example you had earlier, it's above my pay grade. Right. If everybody in the whole thing just has this mindset of they're like, well, I'm just paid to tick and tie boxes. I'm just paid to copy and paste footnotes, and nobody's actually looking more deeply into it, then there's obviously not a lot of pride in that role. So you end up with, as a byproduct of that, not only is the culture bad, but also the quality of everything kind of falls with it.
Yeah.
Right.
Here's what's funny too is, and Bob, you brought this up, is they have studied the pipeline issue. The AICPA put out about an 80-page report that probably took them more than a year to produce. And it had a lot of, I feel like a lot of marginal things in there that would actually maybe help the profession marginally. But it fundamentally comes down to, at the top of everybody's wish list, is they want to be paid really well, and they don't necessarily want to work as many hours as they're being asked to work. If you fix those two things, right, you probably will eliminate a lot of the pipeline problem the minute you start raising the salaries and the minute you're saying, hey, I'm not going to ask you to work 55, 60-hour work weeks throughout the full year. People will line up at the door, in my view, at that day, right? It's not that they don't like accounting, it's they don't like the working conditions. And those working conditions are directly a function of what you said earlier, where your main lever is people. And so these partners have a certain partner profit that they have to maintain. God forbid you're the person at the helm that ultimately says, hey, we have a decrease to our partner profit per income this year. So good luck in trying to get retained in that role. But the partners have to make a decision how much compensation is enough at the partner level. Is $700,000 enough? Is $800,000? Reading reports that it's more than $1 million on average nowadays in at most large firms. And what are we paying the people at the bottom that are still doing 70 to 80% of the work? Is that the right model going forward? Or does there have to be some sort of sacrifice to then incentivize the profession and the people going into it to create a better culture that can then lead to better results from an audit quality perspective, hopefully?
So that's an excellent point. Here's a good way to kind of tie a bow on all of this, because when I look back at my efforts to try to advance all these issues, I sometimes come away thinking they must think I'm intending that audit partners should make less, and that's not my point at all. My point is I think there's another equilibrium point that free enterprise and competition will get everybody to, where it's a win-win situation. And by that, I mean, if you have better workloads, better retention, better year-over-year continuity, better supervision and review, there's some really significant things that start to happen. A less chaotic scheduling environment is much more efficient than a chaotic one. Year-over-year continuity is a big in terms of the profit on an individual audit. Just think about the learning curve and not having to climb the learning curve every single year. And then, so you have the efficiencies there. You have reduced recruiting costs, less training costs. And then the big one would be reduced, settlements and lawyer fees and all of that. And so I think there's a win-win where the partners make as much, if not more. The employees are happier. They enjoy their work more. They see more of a long-term future. And that's a big issue right now in the profession. A lot of people see this as a get in, get out type thing, a starter job. And I see this opportunity, and unfortunately, I've seen it fumbled again and again. The QC standard is a start in the right direction, but as I understand it, a lot of that is essentially non-public. It doesn't call for transparency, and I think. I mean, the old thing about sunlight's the best disinfectant. I mean, everybody's chomping at the bit of importance about transparency, and yet here we are. The PCAOB was unsuccessful in getting its firm and engagement performance metrics approved by the SEC, And if I can just make one more comment, I'm sorry, I can't resist. I think when you look at the PCAOB's proposal, there's an estimate in there of the cost of doing all this, industry-wide. And it was a big range, $371 million to $512 million. It was something that was done very much on the back of an envelope. They were looking at the cost of implementing ERP systems. And I'm thinking, well, number one, they should have applied more elbow grease. Number two, a lot of this was done before AI came to the forefront. And, the cost to pull this information together should be so much less in an AI, powered environment. And then to boot, the firms have all been bragging about their data analytics ability, and we can make, numbers, dance and do all kinds of things. I just think the timing just wasn't quite right.
I think the big moral of the story here is it's quality over quantity. I mean, I feel like it's the age-old mantra, but it's got to go back to that. It's not more hours; it's just better quality hours, right? Whether
absolutely
it's the individual. So that's a lot of, I think, amazing insights and just an overall good dive into the auditing profession and why quality is so important. So if you're watching and you got value for this, do me a favor and follow and subscribe wherever you're tuning in, and share this with any audit professionals who are currently telling themselves, we'll figure it out later. And drop questions in the comments, because future episodes are driven by what you're dealing with in real life: inspections, staffing, careers, tech, quality management, everything the audit profession has been underserved when it comes to media content. So thank you, Bob, so much for being part of the show.
Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you, Drew, and thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Bob.